Hi guys, I'm Danae Brazil and today I'll be doing my F1 driver ratings for the Canadian Grand Prix. It's been a long race weekend. We had another pretty long gap between races. Obviously we had 3 weeks between Miami and Canada. And my God, did we have that made up for by the race we got today. And also a very chaotic sprint, it must be said as well. Just overall a very full-on weekend, so we have a lot to talk about, so we'll get straight into the driver ratings. Of course, we're going to start with Aston Martin, and we're going to start with Fernando Alonso, who I'm giving a 7.5 out of 10 for this week. I was so torn whether I could give Fernando an 8 or not, but unfortunately, because of the car causing him to DNF in both the sprint and the main race, I just think I can't give an 8, even though I do think he was really doing far more than I think we expected from the Aston Martin. There was one point in the race where he was in the points even, and in the sprint he, was doing very well there as well, until obviously mechanical issues caused him to DNF in both sessions. In SQ1 he was also really fast. Obviously made it into SQ2 but crashed the car in SQ1, so wasn't able to put another lap in SQ2. But again, really showed that there is some sort of pace in the Aston Martin, at least in short bursts. So it does give some hope, I think, for the rest of the season for Aston Martin, and especially for Fernando, that he's had these moments this weekend that really looks like he could get something out of that car at least. So I think a 7.5 is pretty good. Yeah, I was so torn about whether I could go higher, but ultimately I don't think he got to finish enough to where I could really justify going for an 8. So I'm going to leave it at a 7.5. Next up we have Lance Stroll. I'm giving a 5.5. Honestly, the extra half point there might be a little generous, but we'll leave it because I don't think it was completely awful from Lance. Of course, it's difficult to tell because this was a race with a lot of retirement, so a lot of drivers really got boosted up the order just for the fact that they survived the Grand Prix. But it's not horrific. He wasn't, I don't think, insanely far off Fernando in terms of qualifying positions or really anything, and he managed to have his car at the very least survive both the sprint and the Grand Prix. So I don't think it's the worst. I find it very hard, of course, to give a score to Lance Stroll because I do think the car is so bad that I can't tell how much is his fault and how much is just the car being awful. And I also think too, Fernando really was out driving the car when he was able to a lot this weekend, and so I think there's difficult to compare the Aston Martin drivers because of that. So a 5.5 for Lance is, I think, a pretty safe kind of rating from me. Next up we have Cadillac, and I'm going to start with Valtteri Bottas, who I'm giving a 5. Even that 5 feels a little generous considering the significant pace difference between him and Sergio Perez this weekend. I don't know what is going on in that car for him to be so far off of Sergio's pace, because in sprint qualifying he's 20th, which is average for the Cadillac, but Sergio is still 3 positions ahead of him, and he doesn't really move up the order a lot either. And we'll get to Perez. I think Perez also had a phenomenal weekend, so that doesn't make Valtteri look any better. But then in the main race, he was the last car of the finishers, and it was just a pretty just bad weekend. Actually, I'm trying to think of another word, but no, it was just not a good weekend from Valtteri. I really, honestly, I'm looking at that 5 and that feels a little generous, but considering who I've given lower, I think it's not the worst. I do think a lot of it is the car. He did complain about having a lot of oversteer issues, but yeah, compared to his teammate, just absolutely nowhere. So yeah, so certainly I think a very kind 5 out of 10 I'm giving Valtteri Bottas. And then on to Sergio Perez, I'm going to give Sergio an 8 out of 10. Despite what I said about Fernando, I couldn't give him an 8 because of DNFing. Sergio Perez did at least finish the sprint, so I'm going to give him the 8 out of 10 because I really do think he absolutely outdrove the capabilities of that car this weekend. Qualifying isn't great. I'm not surprised. It's the Cadillac. I don't expect better. However, in the sprint, he was at one point up in 11th, then after penalties, he finished in 14th, which, while still obviously not great, the fact that he is in amongst the midfield properly racing says that he is getting a lot out of that car, even though I really don't think it's capable of all that much. And then again in the main race, unfortunately DNF had a suspension failure that was so random, but up until that point again was doing really well, was in amongst the midfield. Yeah, Sergio Perez is really, I think, in great form this weekend. Unfortunately, the car did fail him, but I think a really good showing, and I think if the car gets more reliable, there is opportunity there for Sergio Perez to potentially pick up like the odd point if we're really feeling generous. If we have another crazy weekend like this one and the car makes it through, like I could see him somehow snagging like a 10th place. So I think it was really, really well driven, and so it's an 8 out of 10. Next up we have Williams. I'm going to start with Carlos Sainz. I am giving an 8 out of 10. I think this was quite a good weekend from Carlos. Now obviously in the main race it's hard to tell because there's so many DNFs. Like, he certainly boosted up the order, I think, a little because of that. However, it was still very well driven. And so I think it, 9th place, it is some points on the table. I think that's very good. And again, in the sprint as well, 10th in the sprint, nothing too bad there considering I think where that Williams is. And the pace is not great, I don't think. So yeah, I think it's a pretty good weekend. Although as I'm looking at this, I do feel like maybe the 8 is a little generous. Maybe I'm dropping this to 7.5. Yeah, maybe okay, it's a 7.5 for Carlos Sainz. Listen, guys, I normally would wait longer to film my ratings. Like, it's only been like a few hours since the race finished. I haven't had as much time to go over everyone's races in detail, but this is really the only time I have to film this week. So these ratings are not going to be my best because no doubt I'm going to find out additional information tomorrow that makes me regret my choices, but anyway, I think maybe a 7.5 is more fair for Carlos. I think it was good and well driven. But yeah, I am thinking about all the DNFs and thinking that's really boosted him up the order. So yeah, a 7.5. I still think it was a good weekend. Next up we have Alex Albon, who I'm going to really struggle to rate this week because so much of what happened to him was not his fault. Obviously, was unable to participate in sprint qualifying because of damage he gained in practice because he avoided hitting an animal. I forgot what animal, but I don't think that's really his fault. And then that really just became an extra practice session in the sprint because there's no point really trying from all the way at the back. And then in the main race, not a great qualifying again. I do think he left a bit on the table there in comparison to his teammate. And now unfortunately DNF'd because of an incident with Oscar Piastri, which we will get to, but just really unlucky for Alex. I don't think his driving was great, but I also don't think it was all that bad, and I do think the weekend in terms of finishing position looks far worse than how he was driving. So I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10 because I think it's very difficult to give him higher based on finishing position, but I do feel like that feels a little harsh, but it's difficult because we just don't have more information, and this is ultimately where he ended up. Next up we have Alpine. I'm going to start with Franco Colapinto, who once again I'm giving a 9 out of 10. I think this weekend across every session, Franco just had Gasly's number. I think he was really good. He clearly really gets on well with the upgrades they've put on the Alpine, and yeah, to finish 6th in the main race is incredible. Obviously, again, the DNFs cause a lot of people to bump up the order, but ultimately, like, if you put in a good drive, then if things happen ahead of you, you can gain from it. That is part of racing. It's, that is part of a good drive, is if you can capitalize on other people's misfortunes ahead of you. And Franco put together a fantastic race. So I think that was well deserved. And then also in the sprint, he also, came ninth, one position off the points. A really solid weekend of driving from Franco. I'm very happy to see this form from him, and I hope it continues throughout the rest of the season, because the past 2 weekends have been fantastic from him. I think he's really maximising the Alpine's capabilities. So yeah, definitely a 9 out of 10, a very easy grade to give him. Next up is Pierre Gasly. I'm going to give a 6 out of 10. Just way off Franco's pace all weekend. I will say in the race he managed to get up to 8th, so only 2 positions behind Franco, which is very well driven. And there was some good overtaking in there, some good moves. So the main race was good, but in every other session, just nowhere near his teammate. Qualifying, it felt like he was absolutely nowhere. The sprint, overall he was absolutely nowhere. So it's a 6 for Pierre Gasly. I don't have a lot to say, as much as I do think there was some good driving in the main race. He was disappointed by an awful sprint and a pretty mediocre qualifying as well. Next up we have Audi. I'm going to start with Nico Hülkenberg. Pretty anonymous weekend for both Audis this weekend. Honestly, could I just talk about both Nico and Gabby at the same time here? So I will. They both get a 7 out of 10. They both finished next to each other. They both qualified in pretty much the same position near each other in all sessions. Clearly, the Audi kind of lives in the place anywhere between 11th to 15th is where it ends. And yeah, it was a fine driving from both of them. We didn't really see them much, so I don't have a lot to say, but they made it through the race, which I think says a lot considering the race we had. Next up we have the Racing Bulls. I'm going to start with Liam Lawson, who I am giving a 7. I looked at my rating of Liam compared to the Audis, and that made me question things. Wait. No, actually I might... You know what, maybe I will. I'm going to probably boost Liam Lawson up to an 8. I had it written down as a 7.5. Again, these ratings I was hoping to wait a little longer, but I just need to film this. So I'm going to give Liam Lawson an 8 out of 10. I think it was very well driven, especially considering the difficult Friday he had. Obviously he had hydraulics issues in practice, meaning he got only 2 practice laps in, then wasn't able to qualify for the sprint at all. Still managed to finish the sprint in 11th, which I think is very impressive. I think the Racing Bulls had a fast car this weekend, or at the very least in the first half of the weekend they did. And then qualified at 12th I think is pretty good considering. Maybe not quite as good as his teammate, but it's just not bad. Oh, now I'm questioning things again. Maybe it is a 7.5 for Liam. I have no fucking idea how I'm rating this. Just whatever's on screen is correct. I'm going to keep switching between a 7.5 and 8 for Liam Lawson. I don't know yet, but either way, I think it was very well driven from him considering the difficult start to his weekend. And certainly an above average one with whatever rating I put on the screen. And then next up we have Arvid Lindblad, who I think had a... God, now I'm really torn. What? This is so hard to rate for Arvid because obviously he didn't get to start the Grand Prix. And I feel like up until that point I would give this an 8. And maybe I still should, because I think his qualifying was really good. I think his sprint was really good. So actually, I'm going to give Arvid Lindblad an 8 out of 10. I have written down 7.5. That feels harsh. But unfortunately, didn't start the race, couldn't put the car into gear for whatever reason. That's super unfortunate, especially considering how well he qualified. I think it would have been really interesting to see him in comparison to Colapinto, because I think they were kind of in a similar position going into this race. So really unfortunate for him, but when he was on track, Arvid was super good, especially considering this is his first time around the track in Canada. So I think overall a really good weekend and just has an unfortunate ending. Next up we have Haas, and I'm going to start with Esteban Ocon, who I swear I didn't see on track at all. I don't think the TV director thought to show us Esteban Ocon a single time in any session, to be honest. And that's probably because it was quite an anonymous race from him. I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10. I don't think it was bad. I just think the Haas wasn't great this weekend. And yeah, I think he probably got kind of what the car deserved. Nothing awful, but nothing great either. And ultimately not a super interesting weekend of driving from Esteban. So it's a 6 out of 10. And then for Ollie Behrman, I'm going to give him a 6.5 because I do think he was slightly better than Esteban. He was slightly better than Esteban across all of the sessions, but again, not great. The Haas just didn't seem to be a great car this weekend. The upgrades they brought haven't worked. I wonder though if that's more due to Canada being quite a unique track and if they'll work better in the upcoming races, but as of right now, the upgrades did not improve the car, seemingly. And it was a pretty anonymous weekend for Haas in general. But Behrman did manage to pick up a point somehow. I don't even know. He just seemed to have spawned into P10. I guess that is the luck of a race with so many DNFs, is sometimes you just get lucky in how you get boosted up the order. Then next up we have Red Bull. We're going to start with Isaac Hadjar, who I am giving a 7.5 out of 10. I do think this was quite a good weekend from Isaac. Certainly closer to Max on pace, although whether that is more due to Max having an awful time with the car and so it was easier for him to get closer, or if that was just good driving from Isaac, I'm not entirely sure. I'm more convinced of the former considering where the race ended, but I still think it was good. Good points picked up, was in good position to take advantage of some of the DNFs as well, which I think is ultimately a positive. And yeah, nothing too bad. The sprint was very unfortunate. I'm not going to, downgrade him for the sprint. The car had problems. He managed to get back out on track just to do some more practice and get more information, but it was a great sprint qualifying. It was a good main race qualifying. I think it's kind of where I expect the Red Bull to be, and ultimately finished 5th in the race, which is a great points haul. So a 7.5 for Isaac. Next up we have Max Verstappen, who I'm giving a 9 out of 10. Now I do feel like it's a strange one because it doesn't feel like maybe I'm just such a Max fan, obviously, that I just want to give him a 9 because he's finally on the podium and I'm very excited about that. But I also do think that considering whatever was going on with the car, which seemed to be just endless problems, especially in Grand Prix qualifying, I think this was a fantastic result for Max. Super well driven. Obviously, he capitalised on George Russell having the DNF, the McLarens having awful strategy, but again, as I've said several times in this video, good driving does mean that you can capitalise on other people's misfortune, and that is what he did here. I also think the wheel-to-wheel with him and Lewis was phenomenal. Great moves from both of them and a really good drive. I think in the sprint, I'm not mad at him qualifying 7th and finishing 7th because I think that is where I expect the Red Bull to be. For me, maximising the Red Bull currently just means he is directly behind the Mercedes, McLarens and Ferraris. So that is 7th. And that is what he did in the sprint. And then qualified 6th ahead of both his teammate and Charles Leclerc, which I think is important. And then, put together a great race and was able to capitalise and got his first podium of the season. So I think it was a very good race from Max Verstappen, and so for that reason it is a 9 out of 10. Next up we have McLaren. Difficult to talk about McLaren here because the horrific strategy call was on the team and both drivers were on the radio asking them to pit during all of the formation laps that we got. So this is going to be difficult to rate, but I will start with Oscar Piastri, who I have to give a 4 out of 10, unfortunately. Because we'll start with the sprint. The sprint was fine. Qualified 4th, finished 4th. I think that's where that McLaren should be. Yeah, obviously started on the inters, which was the wrong tyre. The track was dry. However, very frustrating to me that Oscar said this several times during all 3 formation laps, and the team refused to pit the car and instead waited 2 laps for them to then pit during race conditions, which is even worse than if they had just pit and started from the pit lane. So that was ridiculous. However, and even though that isn't Oscar's fault, what happens after that absolutely is. We have got the incident with Alex Albon, which clearly Oscar wasn't trying to overtake Alex. I think he was trying to overtake Ollie and then just got kind of stuck. But ultimately that is still a move that is his fault, and that did also cause major damage to the car, caused a 10-second penalty, and once he was there, like, it was race over for him essentially. It just wasn't good from Oscar. And also, like, well, Lando, while he was driving, which we'll get to Lando, but while he was driving, like, Lando was able to make it up through the field some more again, but Oscar, it felt like, was never really capable of getting up through the field, and the McLaren has pace, so I don't really understand what was going on there. Just, yeah, overall, absolutely a weekend to forget for Oscar Piastri. And then on to Lando Norris, who I'm going to be giving an 8 out of 10, because ultimately the DNF was not his fault. That was a gearbox issue. And aside from that, I think Lando drove phenomenally. Again, also had the terrible McLaren strategy. He also asked for those tyres to be changed, and the team said no. I cannot understand them ignoring both of their drivers for their bad decisions like this. Absolutely fucking ridiculous, if you ask me. And it sucks because other than that, I think Lando was in incredible form all weekend. Was really the only threat to the Mercedes throughout all of the sessions. Just consistently really good driving. I thought this was going to be quite a good points haul for Lando this weekend, but unfortunately the Grand Prix just fell apart, you know, between the strategy and then obviously the mechanical issues. But none of that has to do with his driving, so it is still an 8 out of 10 for Lando Norris. Next up we have Ferrari. I'm going to start with Lewis Hamilton, who I'm also giving a 9 out of 10. Pretty much identical to Max, I think, in the weekend. You know, finished slightly ahead of Max in the sprint. And then in the main race, very similar to Max in starting position, finishing position. Again, their wheel to wheel was incredible. It was clear that they both had a lot of fun racing, which is always nice to see. And it's also, I think, nice as a reminder of, like, those two are multi-time world champions for a reason, and why we consider them two of our greatest drivers ever. It was great to see Lewis. Felt like an old school Lewis Hamilton sort of weekend where he felt like way more himself than we've seen since he joined Ferrari, certainly, but even longer than that, I would say. He just seemed super comfortable with the car. Yeah, put together some great driving. The moves that him and Max were putting on each other were fantastic, and overall just a really, really good weekend from Lewis, a really positive step. So it is a 9 out of 10. Next up we have Charles Leclerc, who I have no fucking understanding of what was going on for Charles Leclerc this weekend. I've given him a 6.5 out of 10 because although he finished 4th, I genuinely have no idea how he is that high up in the points order, because nothing about his drive seemed good. Way off Lewis in pace in every session, especially in qualifying, which normally Charles Leclerc is great in qualifying. Obviously that is his best skill, but around this track he's never been great in quali, and certainly not this weekend. Just looked like he was always uncomfortable, always struggling. Just, yeah, quite messy race for him, I think. And so I have to give him a 6.5 out of 10. And finally we have Mercedes. Quite an eventful weekend for Mercedes, that's for sure. And we will start with Kimi Antonelli, who I'm giving an 8.5 out of 10. Now I was tempted to give him a 9, I think put him on par with Max and Lewis. However, my main downgrading for Kimi is the sprint, because I do think getting Listen, the first incident with George in the sprint, Kimi deserved that corner. He was alongside and he was past the mirror. George pushed him off the track. I agree. However, then proceeding to just see red and go for messy, reckless overtakes, I do think is a show of a lack of maturity for Kimi, even though it is great entertainment for us. If we're analysing that as wheel to wheel, it's not great to just start sending it. And because ultimately that also lost him a position to Lando in the sprint. He should have at the very least been second in that sprint, but he finished third because he made dumb choices and it gave Lando an opportunity. And you know, luckily for him in the race, he made up so many points, and we'll get to George in a minute. But again, as much as I think George and Kimi's wheel to wheel is super entertaining, it was messy. A lot of the time I think it's really messy wheel to wheel and feels like some of it is quite unnecessary risk being taken. I don't know if it feels like Kimi will have a really great, well thought out, really calculated move. For instance, that turn 1 in the sprint, and there were some of those moves in the main race as well. But in amongst that too were several lockups, some really messy defending, some really messy attacking. He nearly rear-ended George at one point when he locked the fronts. And so, even though it is ultimately a very good result for Kimi Antonelli, I do think there was a lot of messy driving happening. And I do think that if George hadn't have had the DNF with the mechanical failure, that Kimi and George would have ended up crashing at some point. I'm not convinced we could have gone another 30 laps of racing like that without a crash taking place. And so for that reason, I've given Kimi an 8.5 out of 10, and then straight on to George Russell, who I've also given an 8.5 out of 10. And now while you might be thinking like George DNF'd, Kimi won the race, how they both get the same rating, ultimately, the DNF wasn't George's fault. Very unfortunate to have had an engine failure at such an important time in the championship. Like, this feels quite pivotal. Obviously now the points gap is like 43 points, I think. But up until that point, you know, George qualified better than Kimi in both sessions. He won the sprint. So I do think he deserves credit for that there. However, my criticisms of his wheel-to-wheel are the same as mine for Kimi's. First of all, that turn 1 in the sprint, he absolutely pushed Kimi off the track. And I cannot believe that at the very least the stewards didn't investigate it. I think that is ridiculous. Because even if you ultimately don't think George deserved a penalty for that move, which I think it was on the limit, like, to not even investigate it feels ridiculous when like a 50-50 move like that should be investigated at the very least. And then in today's race, I don't think George really looked comfortable at any point. It felt like he was constantly locking up, constantly really struggling, especially through the hairpin. Like, that turn in particular was a real like point of weakness for George and gave Kimi lots of opportunities to then attack. Again, I think there was a lot of messy wheel-to-wheel going on. I'm very curious to see how this goes throughout the season because this is only round 5, and so I do think we will see more racing like this from Kimi and George, and I hope we do because it's great entertainment. However, it's a similar critique that I've had throughout the season so far, which is I think George's wheel-to-wheel, especially his defensive driving, isn't the greatest. I would like to see a little better from him, but ultimately a difficult weekend for him, obviously, to lose all those points when he should have been on the podium at the very least. But yeah, an 8.5 because I still do think it was very well driven from George Russell, even if a little messy and of course with an unfortunate ending. But yeah, that is it. Those are my ratings for the Canadian Grand Prix. Please don't get mad at me if you disagree. Again, I normally would like to take a full day to really go over everything that happened in the race weekend. However, I don't have time for that this week. So, just what you're going to get. Ultimately, these ratings don't matter anyway. It's just me talking because I like talking about F1. So, don't take it personally, don't take it seriously. We're just talking about cars. But yeah, other than that, I guess get prepared for Monaco. I'm so curious about the Monaco Grand Prix. with the new regulation of cars, I have a feeling it's going to be very boring. I really don't think that these cars will be better around Monaco, but I'll happily be proven wrong because I do love Monaco for the history and the vibes of the track. However, no one wants to watch a race with no overtaking. So hopefully we get something interesting at the very least. But yeah, other than that, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more from me, please subscribe. And if you'd like to see even more from me, you can follow me on Instagram, TikTok, Letterboxd. All those things are linked down below. And you can see other things like the movies I watch and my makeup and special effects work, which is like what I'm actually qualified to do. And yeah, other than that, hope you enjoyed the video once again, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.